Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the CSSR webinar with Professor Amarnath Amarasingam. My name is Dimitrova. I'm currently serving as President of the Canadian Society for the Study of Religion, and it's my pleasure to co-chair this webinar today with Professor Christopher Austin from Dalhousie University. I would like first to introduce Professor Amarasingam, and afterwards I'll give the floor to him to present his topic. He's assistant professor in the School of Religion and is cross-appointed in the Department of Political Science at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. His research interests are in terrorism, radicalization and extremism, conspiracy theories, online communities, diaspora politics, post-war reconstruction, and sociology of religion. He's the author of several books, Pain, Pride and Politics, Sri Lankan Tamil Activism in Canada, and the co-editor of Stress Tested, the COVID-19 pandemic and Canadian national security, and Sri Lanka, the struggle for peace in the aftermath of war. And he has published over 50 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and has presented papers at over 100 national and international conferences. So I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Amarasingam. We are very honored to have him, and he will be talking on a very important topic, Should the Traitors to the Nation, Hindu Nationalism, Past and Present.
Great. Thanks, Diana, and thanks to the CSSR, and thanks, Zabine, for the invite. Let me just share screen here. Everyone can see that? Okay. Yeah, it's always kind of difficult giving this talk to religious studies scholars because I don't know how much is new and how much is kind of well known, but I should note that I don't come to this topic necessarily as a Hinduism scholar, but as a social movement scholar and as an extremism scholar. And I've been watching the Hindutva or Hindu nationalist space for quite a while, and have seen it kind of evolve, and have been looking very closely at some of the online trends, some of the anti-Muslim violence that has happened in the country. And so I thought I'd give just a bit of a primer on where some of these ideas come from, and what's some of the developments on the ground have been and in the online space have been. And then we can kind of open it up for questions if we want to delve deeper on some of those issues. And so there's multiple places in history where this story can be started, of course, but I think World War I is always a good place to start. One of the kind of motivators, one of the drivers, one of the many drivers of contemporary Hindu nationalism, particularly in its anti-Muslim variety that we're seeing today, can be traced, I think, back to this rise of what was known as the Khilafat movement in the First World War. And this was a movement basically by a lot of local Indian Muslims who refused to fight alongside the British against the Ottoman Empire, right? They said, why would we, join along with a colonial power to fight our own people, fight our own brethren abroad? And it actually coalesced into a pretty vibrant movement led by Shaukat and Muhammad Ali, who actually led a kind of hijra, right? Led a kind of migration of 20,000 Muslims into Afghanistan to try to gain some support to fight against the British along those lines. And the reason this is important, the reason the Caliphate movement lives on, I think, in the Hindu nationalist consciousness is because they point to this and similar instances to say Muslims can't be trusted, right? Muslims always have their loyalties elsewhere. Their kind of religious sites are elsewhere. They will always choose Muslims first and Islam first and the global Muslim community first over India and their loyalty and patriotism towards India. And so there's a lot of remembrance, I guess, of this period as a kind of we told you so, right? Muslims can't be trusted, and so keep an eye on them, and so on. Of course, at the same time that this movement is happening, you have Gandhi, who is actually pushing the very opposite kind of movement, which is to create a kind of broader, multi-ethnic, multi-religious kind of secular society. in India. And so one of the people who's pushing back against um, uh, the kind of Gandhian approach is Vinayak Savarkar, who um, is a bit of a thinker, but is also a bit of a revolutionary. He doesn't like Gandhi's kind of nonviolence approach, but actually, starts to stockpile weapons, starts to stockpile, or starts to start a kind of revolutionary movement in the country. And one of the kind of pamphlets, documents he publishes in 1922 is this book, Who is a Hindu? It's a bit much to call it a book because it's pretty short, but it's kind of the one of the clearest early articulations of what Hindu nationalism or Hindutva ideology is actually going to stand for. It's probably not surprising that Savarkar and Gandhi didn't get along. Partly because Gandhi's argument was that one of Gandhi's arguments against Savarkar was that just because you're colonized, just because you're a victim of colonialism, doesn't automatically mean that you're a noble person, right? Doesn't automatically mean that somehow you're um, um, a noble person. So you have to, your victimization doesn't guarantee your nobility, kind of thing, right? And so he says, if you have a revolutionary nationalism and your new country is born out of violence, what you've basically done is put a bunch of violent people in charge of your government now, right? And so the you basically put murderers as your politicians, and so you're going to continuously have a kind of problematic national framework. It's much better to follow a kind of non-violent civil resistance movement in order to gain independence. And Savarkar kind of harshly disagreed with it and said, what you have to do is stockpile some weapons, right? Um, and so in his book, Who is a Hindu? He kind of envisions this notion of Hinduism as or the notion of Hindu as a kind of multi-faceted identity, right? So whenever I talk to my students about this and I say Hindu nationalism, they automatically, of course, assume that it's a religious movement or religion is primary. And what I try to kind of explain is it's actually multiple things that Savarkar means, right? He means geography, he means ethnic identity, he means blood, he means ancestry, he means all of these things. You put all of these things into a kind of blender. And the smoothie of Hindu nationalism comes out, right? That's kind of what he means. Religion, of course, is one aspect of it, but in his kind of famous quote that you're seeing here, Hindus are not merely the citizens of the Indian state because they're united not only by the bonds of the love they bear to a common motherland. So you have this notion of geography very strongly present there, but also the bonds of a common blood, right? And so this idea of lineage, this idea of racial identity is very much um, built into how Savarkar is thinking. About what it means to be a Hindu, which is very different than how we think of identity and citizenship, right? We usually follow things like social contract and citizenship to kind of think of our notion of nationalism. For him, it's much broader and includes much more things. Um, one of the so it invites the question, of course, of well, what about all of this other? India is one of the most linguistically, religiously, ethnically diverse countries in the world. So what do we do with all that diversity? And Savarkar says because Hindu nationalism or what it means to be a Hindu encompasses all of these things, anyone can be a Hindu, right? And everyone is kind of by default a Hindu according to him. And so you can actually this is the big difference I would say between contemporary neo-Nazi movements, for instance, where they have a notion of racial purity where Savarkar doesn't have any sense of racial purity, right? You can convert to Hindu nationalism as long as you live in the country, are patriotic towards the country, um, and see the country as your quote unquote fatherland and your sacred land, right? But the reason I've highlighted if bona fide there is that's the kind of key component that I think is important here, because for him, anyone of non-Hindu parentage or any convert of non-Hindu parentage to Hindutva can be a Hindu if bona fide, which has basically set up a framework where minorities in the country have to consistently prove their loyalty and prove their patriotism over and over again, right? And so if you're a Christian in India, your holy sites are outside of India, and therefore there's a constant test of your loyalty on a regular basis. And that's much worse if you're a Muslim who all of your sacred sites are outside of India as well. And so there's a constant test of your loyalty to be a Muslim as well. The people he considers other and yet indigenous to India, like the Sikhs, the Buddhists, and so on, are much easily accepted, but they also have a sense of loyalty tests that get are built into whether you're truly kind of committed to Indian to what it means to be a Hindu in kind of Savarkar's conceptualization of it. So as I mentioned, he wasn't simply a thinker. He was actually trying to start a full-on revolution against the British. And of course, he was arrested multiple times for these kind of activities, put in prison. There's kind of a legend around how some of his writings made it out of prison. He apparently wrote a lot of his poetry and thoughts on the prison walls, which were then smuggled out by his followers and things like that. Um, And after release from prison, he becomes the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, which is kind of the earlier organizational iteration of some of the organizational aspects of Hindu nationalism that we'll see uh, going on. One of his other kind of key ideas is that Hinduism throughout history is a kind of ever non-changing, is a kind of unchanging purity, right? And he says that whatever changes that we see over time to Hinduism is always was always came from the outside, right? And it came through colonialism, it came through other invasions and things like that. And he says the if Hinduism was left alone, if Hindu identity was left alone, it would continuously be the same. It would continuously be this kind of pure ideology. And he has particular kind of enmity, I would say, to Buddhism and the rise of Buddhism because he calls it the opiates of universalism and nonviolence. He thinks Buddhism has basically emasculated Hindu nationalist identity that by introducing these ideals of love and equality and toleration it's stripped a lot of, some of the more militant aspects of Hinduism, Hindu nationalism, I should say, from its conceptualization, and so that's part of his argument there. Later on, some of the thinkers that we'll talk about add. They have a weird admiration in this kind of militant ability towards Muslims as well, right? Which we'll talk about. So in its organizational form, after independence, after India gains independence in 1948, all of this kind of Hindu nationalist thinking takes an organizational form in the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, loosely translated as the National Volunteer Corps, which is the largest organizational or volunteer organization on the planet. It has 20,000 regular branches, over somewhere between 2.5 and 6 million members in India, and has a very kind of international presence as well. Some of the early, oh, sorry, yeah, it has a student wing, which basically is designed to combat kind of leftist thinking at universities. It works in the tribal communities to kind of combat Christian conversion and Christian influence. It works in elementary schools and high schools, often rewriting textbooks from a kind of Hindu nationalist point of view. Um, it has an international wing, the Seva International, which is quite popular in places like Canada and the US, particularly in Texas, where it does a lot of humanitarian work. In Texas, they became famous for doing a lot of work when the hurricanes hit in terms of helping the local communities out. And so it has a very large presence in India and outside of India in terms of what the kind of organizational arm of Hindu nationalist thinking looks like. Um, some of the early thinkers was Keshav Hegewar. Second leader is Goldwalker. Um, these guys add a level of I would say, and I'm rushing through all this just in terms of time, they add a level of kind of anti-Muslim sentiment, which is quite which is basically hate speech in a lot of in a lot of ways. Hedgewar in particular has a interesting kind of admiration for Muslims, as I said. He'll say things like Muslims are willing to fight and die for what they believe in. How come Hindus can't be more like them, right? So at the same time, it's this kind of belittling anti-Muslim sentiment, but at the same time, it's like, well, we need to kind of adopt the same level of militant outlook in order for our own survival. In order for our own survival. Um, Gandhi's assassination it creates a little bit of a problem for the RSS in India right after independence. His assassin Nathuram Godse was a member of the RSS, and so the RSS was quite swiftly banned in India for a very short time. After some kind of activism, they were unbanned a year later, and Hedgewar basically went on the radio and said, nothing has changed. We believe everything we've always believed, and we're kind of we're going to continue doing what we're doing. But there was a little moment here where the assassination of Gandhi, this kind of national hero in India, orchestrated by the RSS, and for Hindu nationalists, of course, Gandhi was the ultimate betrayer because he wanted to create an India that would be a multi-ethnic, multi-religious kind of situation, whereas for Hindu nationalists, that automatically betrays what Hindus should want. So this is kind of what it looks like. The RSS family, the Sangh Parivar, is made up of, I'll come back to the political wing in a second, but the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the youth wing, the women's wing. There's some good documentaries now on the Durga Vahini, the women's wing of the movement, the Vidya Bharati, the educational wing, Seva International that we talked about, and of course, the BJP, right? It starts as the kind of Bharatiya Jana Sangh, which eventually morphs into the BJP in 1980. And they've held power periodically, and of course, currently from 2014 under Narendra Modi, with the most recent election year being now. And so that's kind of some of the what that organizational dynamic looks like. So that's kind of the very quick history of the thought process and the ideology behind this movement. I'll talk a little bit about what is resulted since then. I always put it in this framework of Stanley Tambaya, who was a Sri Lankan scholar, mainly writing on the context of Sri Lanka, but he talks about this majority with a minority complex, this peculiar phenomenon that he noticed in South Asia, where majority populations with all of their structural and populational privilege and demographic privilege still feel like they're constantly embattled and constantly going to be taken over and lose their majoritarian status, right? So you see it in Myanmar with the Rohingya, you see it in India with the Muslims and the Sikhs, you see it in Sri Lanka with the Sinhalese and the Tamils and the Muslims in Sri Lanka. You see some of this rhetoric against the Uyghurs in China. You see the rhetoric, of course, with the Great Replacement theory and white nationalist movements, right? There's always this weird sense of weird insecurity and demographic panic on the part of the majority that they're going to be slowly replaced and taken over. And so we don't need to necessarily stay there, but this is kind of they point to charts like this to say that there's a slow takeover happening, right? So the Hindu population over the last 50 years or so has been on the steady decline, and the Muslim population over the last 50 years ago has been on the steady increase. And so it's only a matter of time if we don't do something about it that Muslims will eventually take over. And once they take over, they start asking for things like Sharia courts and all of that, right? So there's all this kind of broader rhetoric and anti-Muslim sentiment that kind of comes with it all. One of the first campaigns, or one of the most vibrant campaigns, I should say, that the RSS launched, starting in about 1984, was at the site of the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya. They basically argued that the site of the Babri Mosque was actually the original birthplace of the god Rama, who is, of course, an incarnation of Vishnu, Rama from the famous Ramayana epic in Hinduism, and that this kind of pre-existing temple was destroyed in order to build this mosque. And they argued that this mosque had to be basically moved and a temple allowed to be built there, right? And there was a kind of non-violent political campaign to get this stuff moving, which basically went nowhere for a long time. Finally, in 1992, Hindu nationalists actually marched on the site and destroyed the mosque with their bare hands. Riots soon followed. Thousands of people were killed. And so I should say at the site of the Babri Mosque, which at the site of the destroyed Babri Mosque, a kind of makeshift Hindu temple was set up in 1992, which became the site of kind of Hindu pilgrimage over the next decade or so, which will be important 10 years later, where a train carrying Hindu pilgrims from this site is stopped or comes to a stop in Godra, which is 40% Muslim. Somehow, some way, and there's a lot of debate about how this happened, the train catches on fire. Some people blame the Muslims, some people blame the Hindus, some people say it was an accident, and it's all gone all the way up to the Indian Supreme Court to decide what, what some of the causes of this were. And I think that's still it's something we can not just, leave aside. It's fine. Um, basically, blaming Muslims for the death of some of these pilgrims, weeks of violence started. Some of the worst violence we've seen in India, actually, and I've left some of it off the slide, but basically, pregnant women cut open, their children killed, children force-fed gasoline and then set on fire. Fathers hacked to pieces. Some of the most grotesque kinds of violence we've seen in India, communal violence we've seen in India in a long time. The chief minister at the time that all of this is happening, of course, is Narendra Modi, who was questioned about it when he, ran for national elections in 2014, and basically gave a kind of non-answer that we did everything that we could. And so on. A couple of people were charged later on for some of their involvement, but the kind of 1992 memory and the 2002 memory are kind of etched, I think, in some of the in the kind of memory of communal violence in the country. And it'll have consequences in 2024, as I'll talk about last slide. So that the Babri Mosque episode is not necessarily over, as we'll see. So some contemporary cases of anti-Muslim sentiment that we've seen very recently, which I think is important to keep in mind, looking at the election cycle starting now and what could be in store in 2024 and 2025. One of these was, of course, the 2020 Delhi riots. This came about because of something called the National Register of Citizens, which was brought about in the province of Assam. Fairly mundane quest to kind of register the citizens of the province or register the citizens of the state. And what they realized was that 1.9 million people in the state could not prove their citizenship, right? A lot of them were refugees, Hindu refugees, Sikh refugees, Christians from Bangladesh, etc., that had come into the state that could not prove, that did not have any travel documents, didn't have anything that they could use to register their citizenship. And so the Citizenship Amendment Bill was brought in to try to fast track their citizenship, right? They said that if you're a Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Christian from Bangladesh, Pakistan, or Afghanistan, we're going to help you fast track your citizenship because we can't have 1.9 million people not being able to prove their citizenship in the state. Muslims were noticeably absent from the Citizenship Amendment Bill. And the Indian government at the time basically said, if you are a Muslim that cannot prove your citizenship, you can just go back to where you came from, right? You can just go back to your Muslim majority countries. Of course, the pushback was, we are Muslim minorities. We are usually, Shia Muslims that are fleeing from these countries to begin with. And so we can't simply just move back to where we came from because that's why we left in the first place. The added problem that freaked out the Muslim population in India was that Modi had made it an election promise to institute the National Register of Citizens nationwide, right? So he said, we're going to do this registration not just in Assam but everywhere. And so Muslims were understandably freaked out because if 1.9 million people can't prove their citizenship in one state, how many are not going to be able to prove their citizenship across the country? And how many millions of Muslims are going to be rendered stateless after you bring about this National Register of Citizens in their own country? And so protests started, nationwide protests started, which of course turned violent pretty quickly. And the RSS and the BJP, for their part, have labeled at the time every single protester against the Citizenship Amendment Bill as a jihadist, right? As someone who is out to destroy the country, is launching terrorist attacks and so on. And it's during this period where some of the tweets and some of the online content from Hindu nationalists that kind of make up the title for this the presentation, "Shoot the Traitors to the Nation," right? Any criticism of any policy that the Indian government was putting about became reinterpreted as terrorists, extremists, jihadists, etc., and so on. And then COVID hit, uh, and things got much worse, right? In March 25th, 2020. India, much like everywhere else, went into lockdown. A couple of weeks beforehand, the Tablighi Jamaat, which is a Muslim kind of revivalist organization or reformist organization, revivalist organization, held a large gathering in the Nizamuddin Markaz in Delhi. And it became quickly a COVID hotspot, right? Multiple people, multiple religious leaders from multiple countries came to Delhi, and they all went back to their home countries, and it became a bit of a COVID emergency. This was, of course, not the only religious gathering that produced this kind of spread of COVID, but Hindu nationalists, particularly in the online space, have launched or caught onto this and basically started to argue that Muslims were doing this on purpose, right? And so you had tweets like this, which was, before they wanted to blow us up with suicide vests, now they're trying to blow us up with COVID. So Corona Jihad started to trend, Tablighi virus started to trend on Twitter. It became a whole thing that the spread of COVID was actually a sinister plot by Indian Muslims to purposely infect the population because they were trying to drive down the population, right? Again, majority with a minority complex. This is one of their strategies to kill off the Hindus so that they can eventually become the majority population in the country. Um, so some of the arguments, you can look up this report that we did at the time if you like, but just to summarize, summarize the main themes. We looked at all of the content on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, WhatsApp around this period, and some of the main themes of the misinformation is Muslims believe that they are immune to COVID, that COVID cannot touch them. And so that they're kind of protected by God against COVID. Muslims believe COVID is divine punishment for the Citizenship Amendment Bill. That this is the punishment by God against the majority Hindus, and of course the deliberate spread of COVID as well. So you had literally thousands of videos being spread on all the platforms um, with bizarre stuff, right? With basically videos and stuff taken from other countries, repurposed to look like it was happening now. And so I should say alt news, which was doing kind of God's work at the time, somehow found the energy to collect all of this information, collect all of this misinformation and try to fact check it one by one. So, old video from the Philippines shared with false claim of Muslim man spitting on bread, right? So they would just videos from other countries from other decades would be repurposed to say that, look, it's an Indian Muslim trying to spread coronavirus and things like that. And alt news tried to their credit, fact check every single one by one, which is fun. Um, and so you had memes like this spreading quite widely at the time that while Hindu Indians have buried their head in the sand of secularism, Muslims are slowly trying to push them off a cliff, right? Through media jihad, population jihad, corona jihad, love jihad, etc. And love jihad we'll focus on a little bit because I think um, this was one of the instances where something started in the online space actually had real world consequences. And so this is the belief that or conspiracy that Muslim men are honey trapping unsuspecting Hindu women into marriages to try to convert them to Islam. And so, they would kind of fake falling in love with you, get you to fall in love with them to eventually convert Hindus into the Muslim fold in kind of their ongoing demographic war against Hindus, right? What happened, of course, is that a lot of BJP ruled states like Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh started passing legislation preventing interfaith marriage, anti-conversion bills, They started setting up hotlines that neighbors could call and say that I think my neighbor is practicing love jihad. They started to go into the schools with pamphlets to try to teach parents about what to look for and all of these things, right? So this kind of wave of misinformation that started in the online space, especially in BJP-controlled states, had some real on-the-ground consequences because of all this misinformation. Um, the farmers bill as our kind of fourth case study. I'm not going to go into what the farmers bills are because I barely understand them, but part of the issue here was that because 60% of Indians still kind of depend on agriculture for their livelihood, some of the bills that the Modi government was trying to pass would make it very difficult for them to compete for individual small scale farmers to compete with these kind of corporate and large scale farming collectives that were operative in India. And so there was a massive protest for a very long time from August 2020 to 2021. Um, I would say a lot of these protests went completely under the radar for a lot of Western audiences until Rihanna tweeted about it, which caused a bit of a stir. And it's not like she started a campaign or she had a second tweet or anything like that. She did one tweet and then went about her day. And Greta Thunberg tweeted about it shortly after, and it caused all hell broke loose, right? It caused their effigies were burned in the streets of India, but we say a lot of negative things about celebrity influence, but this is one of the instances where this one tweet that she said actually got some international attention, which I think a lot of people weren't necessarily paying attention to what was going on with the farmers' protests. People have heard about it, but of course the legislation was a bit bizarre and complicated, and so people didn't know what to do with it. But it is a year and a half long street protest. And I think in parts of Toronto, I still see a lot of cars with bumper stickers about the farmers' protest just from that period, because it was a very intense year and a half of very sustained protests to kind of push back against this legislation. And the Modi government eventually canceled all of these bills in 2021 um, just because of all the pushback that they were getting. And because we like to keep things contemporary, January 2024, the Modi or Narendra Modi launches his election campaign in 2024 from the site of the newly built Ram Temple in India. So remember, 1992, it's destroyed. 2002, there's a lot of racial violence. In 2019, which I didn't put on the slide, the Indian Supreme Court gave Hindus the right to kind of use that land to build the temple, a very kind of landmark case in 2019. And so the building of the Ram Temple got underway. A lot of money came in from overseas. A lot of money was set aside domestically to try to inaugurate this temple. And Narendra Modi has now finished building the temple and launched his election campaign from the site of the temple itself. I was expecting some violence to kind of result. There was a few instances in a few states, but for the most part, it's been quiet for now, luckily. But it's something to keep an eye on for sure. Um, and just yesterday, Modi was giving a few election campaign speeches, and the kind of hate speech against the Muslims as Muslim population in the country has already kicked into gear during the election season. So he says, the party that's running against him, the Congress party, is the one that's going to kind of take wealth away from the Hindus and give it to those who have more children, which is, of course, code for the Muslim community. He went on to call the Muslim community infiltrators, and continuously makes this point that somehow, if you don't vote for me, all of your wealth and privilege is going to be reallocated and redistributed to minority communities, particularly the Muslims, right? And so some of this has already started for this election cycle, and so it'll be something to keep an eye on for sure. That's all I have. I'm happy to take questions. I think that was
Thank
20
you so
minutes.
much, Amarnath, for this wonderful, amazing presentation. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And I would also like to invite Chris, maybe if you would like to chair the discussion session, we'll open the, the session for questions.
Sure. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Allison. Oh,
You're muted, I think.
I hate doing that. Thank you for telling me. I don't want to take time from anybody else. But what a fascinating presentation. Thank you, Amar. That was awesome.
Thank you.
So I'm going to do what a lot of people do, which is approach this from their own perspective. I don't do Hinduism, but so much what you said about Hindu nationalism rang true with me in my work in 2 books on Chinese nationalism. So that's where my question comes from. So it reminds me of sort of a blend of Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, just the way you were describing the founder, or these central figures, and their early male masculine networks. When you showed that structure, I'm thinking of Chinese nationalist brotherhoods, gun smuggling, other illegal activities that they do to keep the funds going, the youth and women's movements, like tons of stuff of that in military training, all connected with Confucianism. So my question is, and this might be a question where you say, I don't do that, so I apologize, and just feel free to blow me off. But so fascinating. Like, I love hearing about these different nationalist groups and their leaders because they have so many similarities. But do Hindu nationalists, have they developed their own rituals? Because Chinese nationalists did. That's my first question. And do they have overseas clubhouses?
Um, I don't know about clubhouses, but in terms of rituals, there isn't rituals per se, but they have appropriated certain Hindu gods like Hanuman, for instance, as part of a kind of Hindu nationalist image, right? And so I remember a journalist a couple of weeks ago sent me this flag with Hanuman on it and said, like, what is this? I keep seeing it everywhere in Vancouver or parts of Vancouver, and I was like, well, that's Hindu nationalism. They've incorporated kind of what Hanuman stood for as this protector of India. Um, for their own purposes. And so there's a kind of ritualistic elements there, but it's not ritual as we understand it, I guess. Clubhouses is interesting. I mean, I think there's definitely movements or groups in Canada and the US that are Hindu nationalists in orientation. Like Rise, I think it was Rise Canada, the Canadian Hindu Council, are nationalist in their orientation. But so I don't know if that counts as clubhouses, but there are a lot of these organizations that exist in Canada and the US, which are activist in nature. You know, they'll show up at the school boards. I remember during I don't, maybe Rachel can remind me the the memorandum on Islamophobia that happened in Canada. When that was discussed at the school boards in Toronto, they showed up, right? They showed up to kind of say there there's a difference between um, there's a difference between being anti-Muslim and critiquing Islam and so all this kind of stuff, right? So they're very much front and center in the activism as they exist in Canada and the US. So I don't know if that counts as what you mean by clubhouses, but yeah.
Yeah, just even today, the Chinese nationalists have clubhouses all over the world. And like 40 years ago, they had them everywhere and tons of them. So they're just, sometimes they can be fronts,
Yeah.
and they're not public. But anyway, just little interest of mine. Thank you.
Yep. I think
okay. I
Zabine and
think
then Diana.
Sabine and then Diana. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It's always useful to hear a recap of what these things are because it can get so distracting because there's so many voices at play in a movement like this. And
Yep.
I am wondering, as somebody who's studying or trying to study Sikh activism in the diaspora in Canada, how do outside voices from the Sikh community, for example, or from Muslim activists change or contribute to the definition of what Hindu nationalism is? And I'll a point of clarification. The farmers' protest has a new iteration right now. So they're kind of redoing the referendum from the first time, and it's even bigger in a different way. Because now there's different scales of farming and more incentive momentum from the first one engaging, but it's also a little quieter. It's not as loud online as the first one. And I wonder if you have any takes on that either, but just a comment.
Yeah, no, as soon as I said it ended in 2021, I was like, wait, it started again this year. But yeah, it's definitely a bit quieter, but I think more sustained. It's always tough to know why something is quieter because it could be Ukraine, it could be Gaza, it could be a whole bunch of things that people are, just paying different attention. But um, I don't know if I caught your first question. How do outside forces influence how Hindu nationalists are conceiving of themselves?
Or how does it change? Like, yeah, I guess like how does it change how they might be identifying themselves or other definitions of Hindu nationalism? So if Sikhs are talking about Hindu nationalists, does that give us a different definition, for example, of what Hindu nationalism could be, or is it just a different? Yeah, I don't know if that's even an effective
No,
question.
I mean, I think what I've noticed is the it's not so when Savarkar was writing and some of these earlier thinkers were writing, Sikhs were part of how they conceived of what it meant to be Hindu and part of India. That all started to change with the Khalistani movement, right? Once that kind of "you're not loyal to us" and sentiment kicks in, then you're on the outs with a lot of Hindu nationalists, and so that's where everything changed to the point where can Sikhs be part of what it means to be India? Once they started talking about a separate state, um, which started with partition but really got going in the 80s. Then the conception of how Sikh minority might fit in to Hindu nationalist conception changed, right? And I think that's only gotten worse with the Nijar killing and some of this foreign interference discussion that we're having now. Um, I don't know if I've seen it articulated philosophically, but that's the sentiment I'm seeing. Diana.
Thank you. Yeah, Deanna. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amarnath, for this wonderful, fascinating presentation. And just to come back also a little bit to Allison's question, I've been thinking, that actually this is very important, like the mythologizing of the Ramayana, of Hindu gods for the use, of Hindu nationalism, because there's no coincidence, that Narendra Modi began his election campaign by consecrating the new Rama temple. In a way, Rama, right, the righteous Hindu, and Ravana, the other, becomes Muslim. And I think there's also no coincidence that the women's wing is called Durga Vahini, right? Durga, again, this goddess who is victorious. So I think all these discourses are very religious in nature. So it's the Ramayana epic is so beloved, so well known, but it's been mythologized for a completely different purpose, and it's very difficult to argue against it because the Hindu god Rama is the embodiment of love and all that. Hanuman, it's very difficult to counter all that. So yeah, I think this is the whole danger. There are militant camps, and there's a lot of riots and violence that's there, and you can kind of criticize it. But criticizing the god Ram and all that, it's more difficult. So this is like the soft power, the sophisticated strategy that's working actually. That's why people vote for Modi, and he's always practicing yoga, dressed in orange, behaves like an ascetic. So it's difficult to argue against that. This is how he wins the vote. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think this feeling of embattlement, this feeling of we're a precarious majority, is also influenced by a lot of outside events, right? So I remember seeing like the Syrian migrant crisis, something that had nothing to do with India, would have an influence on, oh, look what Muslims migrating to Europe is doing for European culture, and therefore they're a threat here also in similar ways, right? And so, so that kind of it's always this sense of it's always a sense of impending doom that kind of drives, I think, a lot of politics. I mean, we're seeing it in Canada increasingly as well, which freaks me out, right? And so this idea of something about who we are is at risk, right, with everything that's happening. And that's always a good kind of populist vote getter for a lot of these leaders. And so we have to be careful. Yeah. Rachel.
Hey, yeah, Rachel.
Thanks. I'll just echo all of the praise. This was so, so helpful, Amar. So thank you. My question, I think, comes a little bit out of Deanna's and Alison's and Zabin's, actually. So you mentioned at one point, that religion is just kind of one part of this overarching narrative of what Hindu nationalism is, and that kind of gave us some of the historical context for the setting up of what we think Hindu nationalism is and how it has all of these various parts to it, the land, the blood, etc., and religion is just one. I'm wondering if you see, like, is religion just one always? Or is there certain moments in this history that you kind of gave us where religion is the thing, and other moments where it is just the one aspect? And I'm wondering, yeah, if you see kind of an ebbing and flowing of that particular statement that is just one aspect, if you have reflections on that, and if you think right now is a moment where it's just one aspect or it's the aspect. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, when I say it's one aspect, I don't mean that it's like there's like three separate spheres or something like that. It's all melded together in a nice Hindu nationalist smoothie, right? And so, so that's one aspect. But I do think there are elements when the threat is felt towards their religious identity, at which point the religious element is emphasized. And a good example of that is some of the interviews that were done at the consecration of the Ram temple. They asked, how can a secular leader of a secular country inaugurate his or kickstart his election campaign at the newly consecrated Hindu temple that is an enormously contested temple to begin with over decades. And all of the people interviewed were like, well, this is a Hindu nation. This is minorities can live here and can, we respect them, etc. But this is Hindu culture in a Hindu country, right? And so there are elements where that kind of comes forward as the primary or as the most important thing that resonates, I think, in a certain political climate. So yeah, I do think whenever they feel like certain aspects of that are under threat, that aspect will get emphasized. Much like with the Sikh community, they don't necessarily emphasize the religious aspect, but it's more the loyalty, the patriotism, the keeping India unified, greater India unified, etc. Right? And so whatever movement threatens whatever aspect of it, that'll get emphasized in the pushback.
Okay. Yes, I have a question as well. I'm just looking to see if there is, I mean, and I might also just add in just a little tag on that about this matter of the sort of compartmentalizing or the way in which religion may or may not factor in. Of course, there's also the Parivar has all these different chapters and then some of those are more like VHP is, you tend to see a lot more kind of direct cultural, religious concerns, and then you have like a union or a student group or whatnot. And so, yeah, but I like the smoothie example because that with Savarkar especially, I mean, I've really never properly understood his model of the ethnic Hindu, and I think maybe I should just resign myself to this to that image that you've given us, that he's really just kind of blending these various things together. But the question I had is, often when I'm kind of talking about this material to those who they have a vague sense that somehow, India is getting very politicized, like they're really, really starting from zero, and they want to know about Modi. I draw on the Trump Republican, populism model, to explain how you can have a party leader who may represent a certain party platform, but who's really a populist, and in a certain sense is not might be a kind of a loose cannon for the party itself, in the way that Trump is, obviously a populist, and is not necessarily a kind of a classic Republican candidate. And with Modi, you have something similar. But then I'm often not sure about how far I should push that. And so I guess my question is, do you find it helpful, and just for when you're representing this material to those who are really, coming at it from a zero starting point, when we talk about Modi as a populist, um, do you feel that relationship, his relationship to the BJP has changed in the sense that he is or is not actually acting on sort of classical kind of party agenda? Is his populism something like Trump? Like how helpful is the Trump analogy in terms of representing his variability with the kind of classic kind of tenets of BJP agendas, if that makes sense?
That's an interesting question. I mean, that I don't know how much the Trump Modi analogy works necessarily, because I mean, if the classical definition of populism is the common people versus the elite, right? And so and have particular elites who will kind of talk to the common people, particularly allow, there are the elite are after you, and the elite are trying to keep you down, etc. Um, I don't know that I've seen much of that from Modi. He kind of operates on this different cultural level, because I might maybe I missed it, but I don't think he talks about the elite in that kind of way. Trump, of course, speaks in that way, with the deep state and all this kind of stuff, and drain the swamp, etc. And so I think the populist president works very well with the Trump model. Um, in terms of how he's aligning with traditional BJP, I mean, I think he is whatever he. This is where maybe the alignment with Trump makes sense. Is Trump is the Republican Party now, right? The MAGA movement is the Republican Party now, and in many ways, whatever movement Modi is starting is the BJP. Like it's a charismatic, in a traditional Weberian model, it's a charismatic leadership that we're looking at. This is why I always say Trump is the first charismatic leader the Americans have ever had from a Weberian sense, because you can say Obama was charismatic, but he wasn't a charismatic leader in how sociologists talk about it, right? Whereas Trump, whatever he said, the party fell in line, right? Everything kind of was driven by the force of his personality. And I think Modi is kind of similar. And I should say Modi is modeling himself after the Trump model as well, right? And much like a lot of these other leaders, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, the use of pet names they have for their opponents, and the way they talk about opponents is all Trump playbook that they've taken, because they see it works and does something for their politics. So I would say there's some similarities, but maybe not in the populist sense, but unless I've just missed that rhetoric coming out of India. But
Yeah, I guess I tend to think of his way of representing Congress is to me is the like they're the elite, they're the fancy,
right,
entitled, but I'm just a regular guy. I'm Chaiwala's son. I'm etc.
that's true.
But that does that does help. Sorry, I'm seeing things popping up in the chat. I had my chat window closed.
Ronald
we'll have to wrap up
Reagan.
in 5 minutes, and that was a few minutes ago. Sorry. Um, Thank you. Final thoughts in about 90 seconds.
I'm just wondering, there's
Yes.
one more attendee, maybe Noel. Would you like to ask a question?
Thank you. No, not really. I was wondering whether there's anything resembling a peace movement within Modi's party.
Thank you.
Within Modi's party, I don't think so. There's definitely a peace movements in India, and kind of pushback movements that are trying to push back against the BJP in India, social movements as well as political movements. But I don't know if I've seen any internal critique. I don't know if Sabine can correct me, but I haven't seen much. But
No, I haven't seen any either. It's always outside of, yeah.
maybe that's a good moment to kind of end here, hoping for the better future, peace movements, and strong opposition, and finally, kind of someone else, who can stand up to Modi and will kind of show a different direction. Well, thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Amarnath, for this wonderful presentation. And I believe Zamin will post everything, so we can watch it again and we can invite our colleagues to watch. Thank you so much. This was really inspiring and fascinating. And maybe we should meet again in June, on June 3rd, to find out who has won the elections. But I'm pretty sure that it's going to be very, very